Bernard Brodie, who was one of the early strategists of the nuclear era, wrote in the 1950s, "Thus far, the key objective of military strategy has been to win wars. But from now on," and he's referring to the ascent of nuclear weapons, of course, "the key objective of military strategy must be to avert wars. There can be no other objective." This quote epitomizes what scholars would later call and term the nuclear revolution, that is, the transformational effect that nuclear weapons would have on international statecraft, making wars less, not more, likely. But this theory also always remained just that, a mere theory that could not necessarily explain the way that states armed with nuclear weapons would behave after they acquired them. And yet, the essence of this theory continues to influence and affect our views about nuclear weapons and how they affect international politics. Most people still ascribe the lack of great power war after the ascent of nuclear weapons to their mere presence. These days, however, the resurgence of great power confrontation and contemporary wars are producing new questions about the truism of this theory, about such promises of the peaceful impact of nuclear weapons. And there are three key issues that I will bring up today that suggest that nuclear weapons are becoming more important to international politics and that they may not necessarily bring more peace. The first issue that I want to bring up relates to whether nuclear weapons are producing the same effect on the behavior of different types of states. I would posit that there are key differences in how nuclear weapons affect the behavior of different states and their strategy. Of course, nuclear weapons are the ultimate security guarantee of all the states that acquire them, but those states also conceive of their deterrent effect in distinct ways that are affected by a number of different factors. Geography matters, other military capabilities matter, perceptions matter, traditions matter. Geography matters because the types of military threats that states face are contingent on their geographic and their strategic environment. A large landmass that's encircled by potential adversaries will entail different and perhaps graver and more immediate security threats than a state that's located in an insulated island far away from its adversaries. Conventional military capabilities matter because states think differently about the interaction and interrelationship between conventional military force and nuclear military force. Perceptions matter because states formulate policy based on their understanding and interpretation of their potential adversary. His capabilities may seem frightful, even if he himself believes that his benign intentions should be apparent to all. And tradition and culture matters because the existing nuclear weapon states, including Russia, the United States, and China, all have decades of experience and large bureaucracies devoted to formulating nuclear policy and to sustaining their nuclear enterprise. These complexes each have their own idiosyncrasies, they look different, and the strategic problems they believe they face look different, which in turn produces differentiated strategic solutions. And finally, at the end of the day, decisions with regard to nuclear weapons use, and you probably touched on this yesterday, are down to individuals with their own individual idiosyncrasies and preferences. This range of differences between nuclear-armed states mean that the prospect of conflict between them looks dire, as they may, in fact, be loath to understand the precise logic that underlies the behavior of their adversary. The second issue that I'd like to raise is that these differences mean that the current war in Ukraine produces different lessons for different nuclear-armed states and different actors. Russia, of course, a key protagonist of this war, many fear that the lesson they are drawing in the nuclear domain from the Ukraine war is that aggression under the threat of potential nuclear escalation brings fewer risks. The world's largest nuclear weapons arsenal is, of course, a key reason why US forces, for example, are not currently deployed in a large scale in Kiev. And Russia's conventional military performance shows us that such an alternative reality or scenario, in that scenario, Russia would have been unlikely to consider invasion or to make any type of progress in terms of actually occupying Ukrainian territory. But Russia may also be drawing other types of lessons. It may have learned that nuclear threats and bluster can only bring them so far. Their repeated nuclear threats have failed to make an impression and to affect the Ukrainian will to fight and to defend their country. The Russian leadership may still be concerned about the military utility of nuclear weapons use and whether it would, in fact, outnumber the political consequences it would face as a result of using nuclear weapons. As of now, at least, the nuclear taboo holds even for Russia. Finally, Russia is gaining experience now with how its nuclear threats produce political and military effect in terms of how other states react. Russia is watching Western responses with great interest and taking notes. Russia conveys openly that in a war with NATO, this would look quite different. And it conveys openly that facing a conventionally superior force that threatens Russian territory and sovereignty, it would consider nuclear use in a different way from what it does in Ukraine. Some question the credibility and utility of nuclear use to pursue aggressive objectives in Ukraine. Fewer, I think, would question the credibility of threatening nuclear use to preserve state existence. The United States, other Western nuclear-armed states, and NATO as a collective are drawing other nuclear lessons from Ukraine. To them, this war demonstrates once and for all the nuclear addiction of an adversary like Russia, and how any potential conflict with Russia would be nuclear from or even before the very first day of conflict. Nuclear weapons would constantly and consistently affect the course of such a war. The likelihood of nuclear use for warfighting purposes in a war in Europe would increase dramatically. NATO is renewing its nuclear competency and trying to do so fast because of this challenge. And the security policy communities across the Atlantic are agreeing that nuclear weapons have to be part of the mix to execute effective deterrence of nuclear weapons use. Nuclear weapons will be a more important part of NATO's deterrent mix in the future. Debates on the need for nuclear weapons are also taking place in other theaters, including in the Indo-Pacific. As we just heard, Japanese security and defense policy is changing. South Korea has actively sought a more comprehensive conventional counterforce capability to influence North Korean nuclear calculations and has a debate on nuclear deterrence. Both countries, Japan and South Korea, retain a capability to potentially rapidly develop nuclear weapons should their faith in the US security guarantee recede. With regard to China, many fear that they are drawing similar lessons to Russia as a result of the Ukraine conflict. And the United States and other countries have been doing their best to convince China that aggression in Taiwan would not go unpunished. But Chinese geography and strategic culture also suggests that China has distinct ideas about the strategic utility of nuclear weapons. China is betting more on other types of military technologies for its ability to dominate escalation and exert pressure on a potential adversary. It does not have the same approach as Russia. At the same time, China is solidifying its nuclear deterrent, in part in a response to what it perceives as a potentially lower US threshold for nuclear weapons use. So again, these differences in approaches and lessons learned and potential misconceptions about what the other side is thinking and doing bode badly for how great power wars may play out. And it's also bad news for those who were hoping that nuclear weapons had played out their role as a tool of international statecraft. The third issue I want to raise relates to how these differentials affect Europe and Northern Europe in particular, where we are currently. A new security policy landscape is being shaped in Europe by the war in Ukraine, by the measures that NATO is taking to enhance its deterrence and defense, and by the expansion of NATO here in the north. This new pattern is a result of the current security challenges, but it will be a feature of our future for the decades to come. It will take a lot, I think, to convince European states at some point in the future that Russia is not a force or a threat to be reckoned with. And similarly, it will take a lot to convince a future Russia, even one led by a completely different regime, that the type of force NATO has now and is now generating across Europe and in its border region harbors no aggressive intentions vis-à-vis Russia. We are watching a new Iron Curtain dawn on Europe as a result of the dire situation we are currently in. But the question is if we are paying enough attention to how it can be changed and transformed into something more constructive in the future. The greater relevance of nuclear weapons to both Russia and NATO in the future will have direct implications in this corner of Europe. This is already the case, evidently. We live very close to a key area of Russia's strategic retaliatory capability based on the Kola Peninsula. And in any crisis or conflict with NATO, Russia would take significant measures to strengthen its ability to defend these areas with direct repercussions for the security of our countries. This is a reality that Norway has been living with since it became a member of NATO. It's a reality for Finland and for Sweden as well. And for decades, this proposition has posed strategic dilemmas in the Barents Sea, in the Norwegian seas, as well as with regard to Atlantic sea lines of communication. In a war, Russia and NATO interests will clash directly here in this region. And it's impossible to imagine a war between, or a conflict between NATO and Russia that does not have these direct ramifications in our part of Europe. An expanded NATO means that the strategic landscape in this part of Europe, a part of Europe that's traditionally been characterized by very low tension, this landscape is shifting. It will likely be a question of time before this will affect Russian force dispositions. If no conventional forces are available to Russia, nuclear forces are the backup that Russia resorts to, also for signaling purposes. This means that we should expect and predict that the peacetime situation in the years ahead will become more tense, and we should expect and plan for the fact that a crisis or a war will have a substantive nuclear component right on our doorstep, and with potential implications for how our countries could be targeted. The new European security landscape will be one of iron curtains and hotspots of tension. And Northern Europe is likely to be one of these hotspots. Navigating this landscape will require leadership, creativity, and a degree of pragmatism. And not least, it will require an ability to imagine a future European security order that takes account of the fact that a part of the European continent is Russia, and that Russia is likely to remain a different place than NATO Europe for some time to come. Thank you very much for your attention.
The other day, Putin said that he has now transferred nuclear weapons to Belarus. Is this to scare or to use?
My interpretation would be that this is primarily to scare. It's a measure taken for signaling purposes, not least with regard to Western states. And Russia's had a long-standing grievance with regard to NATO nuclear policy and how the United States has deployed its nuclear weapons on the territory of third countries. And in one way, one could read the Russian measures taken with regard to Belarus as a response to this long-standing grievance that Russia has had.
I brought up the question yesterday, is there a difference between tactical nuclear weapons and strategic ones? I put the question to you as well.
There are differences in the distances that nuclear weapons can travel, and there are differences with regard to the yields, that is the explosive power of nuclear weapons. And that's the reason why traditionally there has been this delineation between strategic weapons and sub-strategic weapons or tactical nuclear weapons. But at the end of the day, the key delineation is that between nuclear weapons and conventional weapons. And I think that delineation also has a certain impact on Russian deliberations and discussions. I don't think that delineation is completely blurred, even in the Russian context, even if many portray it as such.
Who would be the worst new member in the global nuclear club? Good question, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's easy to think along the lines of the most likely new members of the world's nuclear club, where a lot of people are preoccupied with the dynamic that an Iranian nuclear capability would produce in the Middle Eastern region, with all the potentially destabilizing effects that could have on politics in that region.
Thank you.